Hey, Merry Christmas to you all. In this video, I'm not really doing anything to do with Dungeon World, but I thought I'm going to make a video on it anyway, and I hope it does something to help clear up some stuff about window lists, and I hope my graphics here don't confuse you with all their arrows. So basically a window list is a really cool way for you to be able to add repetitive data types to something. So an inventory is a window list. A list of abilities is a window list. There are a number of elements that you need for your window list. So the first part is obviously the window list, and on this particular graphic we can see that in this top left hand corner, my sample window list, it's got a heading or a label, it's got a I add and an I edit button, and then this white box here is the window list. So we can see here my window list is called sampler. So that's the window class, sampler, and these are the elements. You can see there's a frame, that's the back part. Then we've got the label, we've got and then we've got I add and I edit buttons, and we have the list sitting on top. And in fact, frame is not actually the back section. In this case, the frame is this light grey section on top. We've also, you can see here in the back, we've got something called sample. Now, sample is this window frame here, and this window frame has a link, it has a name, has a lock button, has a close button, and then it has a sub window, which we can't see here because this is just the finished data. This is what we're actually seeing in Fantasy Grounds. The sub window contains the sample content. Now, use a sub window because you can have scroll bars and things like that, and it works better for resizing. And also, if you had a tab here, say we had one with stats and one with description, or we might have had stats and notes and description. You had multiple tabs, each of them would make a different sub-window, the active window. And then finally we have what I've called sample detail. The sample detail is what appears in the list. So we have to create another window class called sample detail. You can call it whatever you like. These are just typically what I do. I call it sample detail or sample character sheet, sample NPC list, sample CT list, something like that. And they will typically have a link, they'll typically have a name, they'll typically have an I delete button, which is set to invisible, but you might also have some other fields like a attribute value or a modifier value or an icon for a dice roll or other similar elements. In this case it's quite simple. We've got a link, the link opens the sample window, the name is the same name as from here, so if I edit effervescent wand, it will change the entry in the list because it's looking at the same data. This is just a different view of this data. Now, my list is called sample list. That's the window list here inside my sampler frame. So the window list, so you can see here number one. So that's the first time I use sample list. Now, over here in this next section, we can see some of the fields that you ought to be aware of when adding or creating a window list. Accept drop classes. We want to configure this, and now that's if we want to be able to drag and drop elements into your window list. And typically you do. It's one of the nice features of window list. Use it. And in this case, my class name is called sample. Sample refers to this set of the data that makes up this record over here, and so that's it. The class name is sample. In very rare situations you might have more than one class that can drop into a window list. It's unusual. You then have allow create is typically done, and allow delete is typically true. We next have class name, and in this case class name is the window class that will be used to fill out the list. So it's still looking at the sample data, but it's a particular view, and the view is obviously a horizontal view that all fits on one line, or sometimes it might be on more than one line. But we can see here that sample detail is the same sample detail up here, which is our horizontal view. We've got a link, name, and I delete button. The other fields that you ought to be aware of is minimum height. Now, in this case, because my window list is anchored top and bottom, so it's anchored both. Actually, that should have read down here, I've got bottom, it should read both. So the record, the window list, if it's anchored top and bottom, the minimum height is not really required because it will pull itself out. But typically you will set the minimum height value to the same as your height value, and that will make sure that the initial display of the window list fills that space. Otherwise, you might end up with a window list that you can't drop something onto because it doesn't actually have any size just yet. The next section is really important, list underscore text. This template includes a bunch of script files that associate the actions from your iEdit, iAdd, and your iDelete buttons. So this list text is really important. You must add that advanced template. There is another way. There's a script file that's part of that template, and you can add the script file as a custom properties. That's an alternate way of doing it. And our name is sample list. We've talked about sample list over here. This is the name of it over here. This is where you actually name it. Now, I've highlighted it, I've underlined it because it's really important for some of these next sections. So the next section is iAdd. So the iAdd button has a bunch of buttons or fields that you need to add in. You want to add the icons for normal and pressed. You want to add the template. So the button iAdd. Now over here on iEdit, it's the same thing, button iEdit. You need to add some custom properties where the name is target and the value is sample list, sample list, sample list, sample list. So the target needs to be sample list. In addition, you need to name your iAdd buttons and your iEdit buttons with sample list. So sample underscore list, which is the name, underscore iAdd. So if my list was called inventory, it would be called inventory underscore iAdd. If it was called magic list, it would be magic list underscore iAdd. And the same for iEdit. So it's really important that you keep that naming consistent there. We also have a data source over here. And the data source, me personally, I call it the same as my list, but I just remove the underscore. And the full stop means that it will create this data in the database under its parent node. So if this window list was on the character sheet, like inventory is, all those items in that list will appear in a window list called, or they'd be under a node called sample list, which would be under the characters node. So that those items would be associated with that character. If this was a top level window list, then it would just be a top level in the database. So you want to put the full stop in here for your data source. And I think they're the key gotchas that always trip me up, or I always have to go back and double check when I am creating window lists for the first time in a new project. Of course, the second time, I just copy my window list, paste it, rename all the bits and pieces. But the first one in each project, I always make the same mistakes over and over again because I miss some of these steps. Hope you find it useful. I'll see you guys soon.